Welcome to Mind of the Forest, a podcast of the Louisiana Forestry Association. Hello, I'm your host, Jeff Zeringue. In Mind of the Forest, we talk about forestry, how important managed forests are to the environment, and the benefits they offer to wildlife and water protection. Those benefits are why the LFA promotes keeping Louisiana's almost 15 million acres of forests as forests. And the forest products industry, including forest landowners, loggers, and wood manufacturers such as lumber, paper, and pellet mills, plays an important role in the conservation and management of forests for the important renewable natural resource it is. This episode of Mind of the Forest is sponsored by First South Farm Credit. First South is your premier rural lender. With over 100 years financing timber and agriculture, they have the expertise you're looking for when financing rural property. If you're looking to purchase or refinance land, call your local First South Farm Credit office or find them online at firstsouthland.com. This is episode 62 of Mind of the Forest, where we visit with Corey Shircliff. Corey is a geologist with Cavern Solutions in Baton Rouge. She was a guest speaker at the LFA's 78th annual convention last August, and she talked about the geology of underground carbon sequestration. Because we thought the subject is still topical, she might make a great guest for Mind of the Forest. So we can talk about that subject today. Here's Corey. We have with us Corey Shircliff. Corey is a geologist with Cavern Solutions out of Baton Rouge. Corey, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Glad to have you. We had you at the annual convention this year in Lake Charles. It gave a great presentation, and I really thought that having you on Mind of the Forest would be a good show for folks because they can get a better understanding of what carbon sequestration really is. But before we get into that, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from?
Sure thing. So like you said, my name is Corey. I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, actually, but I've been down here in Baton Rouge, actually, for about 15 years.
Okay.
I have my undergraduate degree in geology. I got that in Wisconsin at a small school called Beloit College. And I got my master's degree in geology at Louisiana State University. Go Tigers. Okay. So that's what brought me down to Baton Rouge and met my husband there. And I've been there ever since, pretty much. A couple years in Houston. And so I worked, my background is that I've worked at, started out with an oil and gas company. That's a couple years I was over in Houston and came back over to Baton Rouge in 2015. And I worked for the state as a regulator for almost 10 years. And for the last year, I've been doing consulting primarily in the underground storage space with my company, Cavern Solutions.
Okay. Real quick, I know geology might be understood, but what does a geologist do?
Sure. That's a great question. There's lots of different types of geologists. In Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, a lot of times it means that you work somehow in hydrocarbons, oil and gas production, exploration, that type of thing. A lot of us are in Houston and work in that sector. But there's lots of different types of geologists. There's geologists that work in the water industry, the environmental industry. I have a little bit of that background. There's geologists that work in mining, mineral exploration, that's not hydrocarbon related. So there's lots of different subsets of geology. In Louisiana, you typically can find oil and gas geologists, hydrogeologists, that's the folks of us that work with water, and environmental geologists who are, ensuring that the groundwater is not contaminated or if something has happened, that it gets fixed up. So that's the type of geologist you can find down here.
Okay. Well, today's subject is carbon sequestration and storage.
Sure.
We are familiar in the timber industry or in forestry with carbon sequestration because any carbon that is in the trees from the natural process of living is stored in there once it's harvested and made into products and whatnot. So we've been doing that for a very long time, but this sort of carbon sequestration is new, is it not?
Yeah, it's certainly newer than trees fixing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Folks have been doing some iteration of what we're referring to today as carbon capture and storage, or sometimes carbon capture and underground storage. And the The underground part of that is really what's different here. It's the same premise. We're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and we are injecting it into the subsurface. That is the way, as the trees take it out of the oxygen, or out of the air, and fix it into their roots and their leaves. In carbon sequestration, you're injecting CO2 into the subsurface with the idea that it would stay there forever and never emerge back into the atmosphere. And in that way, reducing the amount of CO2 that is either emitted or already exists in the atmosphere.
Curious, can you say about taking carbon out of the air, but is it a byproduct of certain industry to create more CO2, and so you're not really taking it out of the air, are you?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. The CO2 in this sort of, I'll say, early phase of these projects is primarily coming from what we call a point source. Mm-hmm. So maybe a plant or a factory or a pipeline company has some CO2 related to their product, but it's a waste product. They don't use it. Mm-hmm. And so instead of just letting it vent into the atmosphere, they would inject it into one of these wells. Now, there is a technology called direct air capture that is, I'll call it emerging. It hasn't been deployed at scale yet, but there's a lot of interest in it. And that is actually passing, the air that we breathe through somewhat of a filter type process and capturing out the CO2. And then in that way, they could inject it into the subsurface. Now, we really don't see those projects yet. They're, like I said, they're not at scale. They're very expensive to deploy right now. These initial projects that we're seeing are typically these point source projects. Instead of CO2 coming out of a stack at a plant, they're capturing it and sending it down into a well, into the underground geology.
The actual capturing of carbon isn't necessarily new, though, is it?
No, it's not. Different companies for different reasons have wanted to capture their carbon all over the world instead of emitting it. And sometimes it's because there's a need for that CO2 in some sort of industrial process. Sometimes it's because the company, recently we see this, companies have a low carbon standard they're trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. And for that reason, they don't want to emit CO2 into the atmosphere. There's different reasons. But as long as it's coming from a point source, it's not terribly hard to capture it. It's expensive, but it's doable.
Yeah. So I don't know if you can put a dollar figure to it, but something relatable to how much does it cost to capture carbon?
I wish I had those numbers for you, but that's really not my area of expertise.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. It's not a new process. It has been done, and I think, as you said, it's more of a waste product in some things, but it has been used in harvesting oil and gas, is it not?
Yeah, it sure has. And that is some of the oldest injection of CO2 that we see here in the U.S. The first use of it is in something called tertiary production, which, not to get too technical with that, but essentially after an oil field is produced, when it's not producing very much anymore, toward the end of it, the life of a field, you can inject CO2 into the field, and it actually frees up those small atoms of hydrocarbon to get produced out of an oil and gas well. So it sort of frees it from sticking down around in the subsurface. Okay. And the CO2 is injected and it's sort of pushed through a reservoir and it pulls out a lot of oil in this case with it. So that is one way. I mean, that's probably been deployed in the U.S. for at least 50 years, maybe even longer than that.
Where did that carbon come from for that technology? Was that mostly waste from plants or?
Well, actually, I think historically a lot of it has been naturally produced. So before folks really realized that CO2, which is carbon dioxide, of course, was potentially having some impact on the air that we breathe or the oceans, they would actually produce CO2 from the ground to use for these processes. And in our region, one of the most prolific CO2 producers is a place called Jackson Dome over in Mississippi. A lot of the enhanced recovery CO2 in Louisiana comes from that. So it's not been emitted, it's actually produced out of the ground.
Okay. So instead of capturing it, they produced it.
Correct.
And that was transported through pipelines, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a one major CO2 line out of the Jackson Dome, and it has different branches, but that's how it's been transported to these oil and gas production fields.
Okay.
Several of them.
Does it seem to be more effective? I guess it depends on your point of view, but more effective to capturing carbon that is being made as a byproduct or waste product by some industry rather than created itself?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been asked that before. The CO2 that comes out of Jackson Dome, works well for this enhanced recovery process, but it's pretty similar to the types of CO2 that you would be taking out of your plant instead of letting it emit. It's very similar. The main difference is there might be a small amount of different types of other gas with it, but for the most part, that doesn't make a big change on your enhanced recovery operations. So I wouldn't be surprised, as different companies have goals to achieve these low carbon fuel standards. If some of that Jackson Dome production is decreased and replaced with some of the emissions.
Okay, once it's captured, it's condensed, it's put in pipelines, it gets to an injection well.
That's right.
Injection wells have been in Louisiana for decades. I mean,
at least 100 years, I'd say.
100 years. Okay. Yeah. Take us through just the process of getting it from the surface into a geographical area. And then you can talk about the geographical area that you think is safe or why you put it there in the first place. Let's say that.
That sounds good. So, and I'm going to back up for 1 second and just talk about the injection wells that are already in Louisiana, because I don't want to confuse anybody. The injection wells in Louisiana, there's a lot of them. There's thousands of them actually. But those fall into a different type of well. They're not these CO2 sequestration wells. None of those exist in Louisiana yet. The wells that do exist are injection wells, like saltwater disposal wells. Those are the most prolific of the wells in Louisiana. And those types of wells will inject brine that comes up with the production of hydrocarbons. So the commonly, maybe only a few hundred feet away, is a production well. And you would take the brine that gets produced with the oil or gas, collect it into a tank and inject it back down into this injection well. And that serves a lot of purposes, but number one, it's much safer to inject it back right there than to put it into trucks on the road, for example, or transport it long distances. So very commonly, if you see a production well in Louisiana, there's going to be an injection well for it nearby.
Okay.
And those have been around for, like I said, I mean, I think the earliest record I recall of seeing of one when I was at the state was probably from the late 1920s.
Okay.
And that's been serving that business need for a long time. The other types of injection wells in Louisiana are these enhanced recovery wells that we just talked about. There are injection wells that inject waste generated at different types of like plastics facilities or other industrial facilities. Most of those happen to be along the Mississippi River corridor, probably to nobody's surprise. Typically, those wells are located on the property of a plant. Again, the goal there is to reduce the transport of what can be some fairly hazardous substances. So the types of injection wells we're talking about today are called Class 6 injection wells. There's CO2 sequestration wells, and a CO2 sequestration well, like we said, there's some emission source of CO2. Gets transported sometimes not very far from the point source. There's a few of these projects that are being proposed in Louisiana where the transport is maybe just 2 miles or so of pipeline. You typically would not put CO2 in a truck. It wouldn't make a lot of sense. You'd need a whole lot of trucks. So pipelines is the most practicable and the safest. It'd be a lot safer than having hundreds or thousands of trucks with it.
Philosophy is the same with oil and natural gas. You have the hub down south, and
absolutely,
it just makes more sense to transport it by volume that way than it does putting it on train, car, tanks or trucks.
Yes, sir. Absolutely, no doubt about it. And when the CO2 gets to the wellhead, which that's the surface expression of a well, and a wellhead is if you live in Louisiana at all, you've probably seen one. And a wellhead is a barrier at the surface that is welded on to the actual well in the subsurface and prevents anything from coming out that ought not to. Okay. And so the wellhead, the CO2 would go through a valve in the wellhead and be injected down. Typically in Louisiana, the average depth of injection is around 6,000 feet below the surface. Nobody would consider coming shallower than around 3,000 feet in Louisiana for a couple reasons. You want the CO2 to stay compressed. It doesn't travel as far when it's compressed. And you also don't want it to get too close to the drinking water. The drinking water in Louisiana can range anywhere from just a couple hundred feet below the surface down to almost, a couple thousand, really, depending on what part of the state you're in. Mm-hmm. So, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I hope you'll let me the regulations around that, because there's substantial.
We want to get into that. I mean, it's a new process. It's
a new process, but it does fall into the existing framework of an injection well regulations, which is in Louisiana. There's been regulatory oversight since the early 80s on all these wells.
Okay.
So when the CO2 is injected, like I said, the goal is to keep it compressed, and it moves out into a formation. And I think a lot of people think of it as going out into like a cave or a cavity. That's really not what's happening. It's going into like a sandstone rock. And if I had a piece of the sandstone rock and like threw it at you across the desk here, it would probably hurt. It's a rock, it's, and it looks like sand, like you would find at Orange Beach if you go there, if you've been there before, but it's just compressed really tight together. It wouldn't just fall apart in your hands necessarily. It's more of a rock than just loose sand. And so the CO2 is injected into the little spaces between all the sand grains. And it's under a lot of pressure at that depth, the overburden of all the rock pushing down on it. Thousands and thousands of feet, all of that weight of rock keeps it compressed. And so, for that reason, the CO2 doesn't travel very far away from the wellbore. It acts a lot more like a liquid than it does a gas at that depth.
Okay.
And the folks that are proposing to inject CO2 in the subsurface, part of their number one job is to model and predict where that CO2 will reside in the subsurface to ensure that it's going to stay in place.
Okay. What do you look for when considering an injection well for carbon storage?
Well, you want a site that is hopefully close to your emission source. You want to be in an area where there are very few oil and gas wells. Any type of well like that is a potential leak path if it goes down deep enough. So when folks are looking in areas of Louisiana, they're probably looking at areas that maybe they're sort of adjacent to an oil and gas field, but there's been no production from that area because you don't want to have too many wells to deal with. So, and then you want to make sure you can find this type of rock, a sandstone, typically, at a depth that's deep enough to keep it compressed. And in Louisiana, that happens to be in most of the state.
Really?
Yeah. Now, I will say Northwest Louisiana is pretty much off the table. And the reason for that is the Haynesville wells and the Cotton Valley drilling. There's so many wells that, and they're deep, they're very deep, that there's really no chance of you finding a spot where you can store CO2 and you don't have to worry about a well because they're pretty much at least one every square mile. So Northwest Louisiana, for that reason, is really not as popular as the rest of the state, where you can find areas that haven't been drilled yet.
There's a lot of work that goes into going through that permitting process. Can take us through that process? Where does it start, and what do companies have to do to assure that
Sure thing.
they can even get a permit?
Mm-hmm. And so when I was working at the state as a regulator, one of my jobs there was overseeing all of the injection well permitting in Louisiana. And I also worked on developing the regulatory oversight program for these types of wells. And so the reason that the underground injection control program exists, that's the group that oversees injection wells in Louisiana, is because of law that was passed at the federal level in the 1970s through the Safe Drinking Water Act. And I bring that up because the power and the reason sort of for its existence, the UIC program, is to protect the drinking water. Mm-hmm. And so the UIC program contemplates how can people inject while not impacting our drinking water sources. And that type of approach means that the permitting to inject these substances can be quite intense. So some types of injection wells is a fairly straightforward, simple process, like these saltwater disposal wells. There's so many of them in the state. There's a lot of history with them. There's standards that have to be met. It's pretty clear to everybody what those are. Mm-hmm. The other types of injection wells that are overseen by this group, the class 1, like I said, these industrial waste wells, some of the injection related to salt dome storage and underground storage in Louisiana, and then also these class 6 wells. These are very intense permits. They are, although the technology has been developed, there's a lot more site-specific scoping that goes into these to make sure that you've picked the right site to put them at. The permits commonly for Class 6 are what I would consider to be the most robust, the most serious types of permits, and it can commonly exceed 1,000 pages of documentation, reports. And a permit is required for any Class 6 well. That's our CO2 injection wells. Mm-hmm. The permit requires you to prove that the injection activity you're pursuing will not impact the drinking water or impact the health, safety, and welfare of the public of Louisiana. And the first part of that is the federal oversight that the state enforces. Mm-hmm. And the second part of that is Louisiana law, although it's all under law now. So since the early 80s, the state has been in charge of this program.
Okay.
And they added the Class 6 program last year. So if an operator is interested in a Class 6 permit, they have to, first of all, find a suitable location. They have to decide how much CO2 they think they can inject and where the CO2 will reside in the subsurface. They have to design the injection well, and these wells are, they're sort of state-of-the-art wells, if I could explain them that way. The material compared to like an oil and gas well is how I'm comparing it. An oil and gas well is made with regular steel tubulars. These Class 6 injection wells, they're required to compare the CO2 that they're injecting and ensure that whatever metal that they select, which is commonly a chrome type tubular, will not be corroded or impacted by the CO2. There's a lot more material suitability that they have to do from the actual construction perspective. Like any injection well in Louisiana, there's extra what's called casing to protect the drinking water. Mm-hmm. And it's not just the drinking water that we actively pull out of now. It's what's called the underground source of drinking water. And it's anything that could be considered drinking water in the future. So just because people aren't actively using it now, it has a low enough chlorides and total dissolved solids content that it could be feasibly cleaned up to become drinking water in the future. So usually, if folks are pulling from, for example, a 200-foot aquifer, the bottom of the actual drinking water, what's considered the underground source of drinking water, which is a technical term, could be hundreds of feet below that, if not thousands.
But they can tap it at just a couple 100 feet.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the premise there, of course, being that in the future there may be technology that could more inexpensively clean up those water sources that you wouldn't want to drink right now.
Yeah.
But and are expensive to clean up right now, and by clean up I mean remove the salt content in the dissolved solids.
Is it? And I don't know if this is correct. So now that I have you here, I got to ask you.
Sure.
The deeper the water, generally the saltier it can be.
That's typical, yes. Now, there's some exceptions, especially down in South Louisiana, but as a general rule, yes, I would say that's correct.
Okay. The Class 6 seems to be the most stringent in Louisiana. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. But they have injection wells that you inject chemicals into the ground rather than naturally occurring substance like CO2.
That's right.
That the process isn't as tough as the Class 6. Why is that?
Well, those wells that you're talking about, what are called Class 1 wells.
Class 1. Okay.
There's a long history of those wells in Louisiana. Most of the wells that operate today that inject these industrial wastes have been injecting since the 70s, if not earlier, the same wells. So there is a pretty clear definition of how those wells can be successful. And there's a history older than me and maybe even you that
I think so.
Yeah, that would suggest that these wells are safe. And there's never been a groundwater incident associated with those wells since the UIC program has existed in the early 80s. Some of those old ones I'm not sure about, but these those types of wells do inject some wastes that are very acidic, for example, or they may have like a high heavy metal constitution in them. And similarly to the Class 6 program, those wells have to be they have to be modeled. The modeling is a little bit more straightforward. There's like a 2-mile, not to get in too much to the weeds, but there's a 2-mile automatic investigation, or it can be bigger if it's modeled to show that plume is going to be bigger. But yes, I mean, these wells have been injecting for a long time, primarily, like I said, in South Louisiana. And some of it's not too bad, but some of it is very hazardous type material. And it's all fluid. I want to say that too. It's water type material.
Okay, so now we're in the process of learning the new injection wells for CO2.
Sure.
It is a new technology, as you said. So I guess that's what makes it more, that's what makes the government look at it more closely as to whether it's going to be safe.
That's right.
Okay. Does it affect any sort of future oil and gas exploration?
Well, one of the findings that has to be made to issue the permit involves examining whether there is production of economic capability in that zone, and there can be. Now, there's been a lot of discussion in parts of the state where there is this history of hydrocarbon production about, what if there's hydrocarbons below, for example, where the CO2 will be injected. And that hasn't really been figured out in law or regulation yet. But there are ways that those hydrocarbons can still be accessed via directionally drilling, things like that. So just because a CO2 plume will exist in the subsurface doesn't mean that you can't access hydrocarbons that may be below it. It might make it a little bit more expensive to do so. There's probably some legal questions about how, going through the plume and the CO2 plume. But, over time, the CO2 will dissolve into the brine. So essentially, the longer that CO2 is down there, the safer it would be to drill through. So again, it's not something that is permanently taking this hydrocarbon exploration off the table, just adding another level of complexity to it.
Well, I guess let's backtrack a little bit. I've heard some folks question, how do you know it's going to stay down there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's part of the permit involves showing that it's going to stay down there.
Okay.
So the model that's created is one of those things that examines the geology. So when CO2 is injected into the sandstone, yes, you have to find the sandstone, but you also have to find the confining rock that keeps it from coming up above that.
Okay.
CO2 will flow through the sandstone. Or permeable type formation like a sandstone.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of the sandstone, and this is in Louisiana, you will need to find a shale that's considered your cap rock. And a shale is, for those who don't know, is a type of rock that has a very low permeability. And permeability is the measure of how fast a fluid flows through a rock. And you want a very low permeability, as close to zero as possible. And most of the shales in Louisiana do have that. That's a result of how they were formed. Not to launch into geologic history, but a shale typically will not allow for any flow through it unless it's fractured. And the regulation in Louisiana says that you absolutely cannot inject at pressures that would fracture the shale. So there's a safeguard there. From a geologic perspective, the other thing that applicants have to consider is if there are other production wells in the area that could serve as sort of a channel or an avenue for CO2 to escape out of. That's sort of the man-made risk of living in a state where we've had a lot of history of hydrocarbon production, and so those wells, have to be located. If they don't have great records, they're going to have to be replugged. Mm-hmm. The applicant has to have financial surety to do that. There's a lot of requirements around these deficient wells as part of the permit process to limit or eliminate that risk.
Is it up to the company that's applying for the Class 6 well permit if any of those old wells need to be recapped?
Yes.
So so that's an added cost that they need to be considering. Correct. Of where they're going to put something. That's if right. That could be a problem.
Yep.
Okay. So you look for shale to keep it down there. You look for sandstone to keep it in there. I imagine it's pressurized to get that far down, mm-hmm. and of course the pressure is greater down there. How does it stay? I mean, I've heard someone describe something like shaking up a Coke can or something like that, and eventually the Coke goes flat.
Sort of. A Coke can goes flat because you've opened it and the CO2 has come out of solution and come out. So we don't want it to do that.
Right. Okay.
We want it to stay compressed.
Okay.
And so the way that it stays compressed is that it never escapes. And like I said, the permit has to show without a shadow of a doubt that is the case.
Okay.
And it's a little bit hard to imagine, even for me, and I've worked in this sector for 15 years, but the CO2 is like a fluid when it's supercritical, but it has a different density than water. So if you imagine dumping, like the way that it would probably look is if you dumped like some brine into a fresh water, like a cup, mm-hmm. a clear cup, you could see that brine, which is heavier, goes down to the bottom, and it lacks some of the clarity that the fresh water has. That sort of difference is probably how the CO2 supercritical plume would look when it's up against the brine that already exists in the formation. So it's a different density. They're both fluids, but they're a different density. And because of those density differences, they stay segregated. Now they're up against each other, but they don't, at least initially, they don't mix. And then as time goes on, the CO2 begins to dissolve in the brine. In some cases, some of the CO2 actually mineralizes out, depending on the geochemistry of the fluid. And there's a lot of things, again, that go into the permit to show that. Okay. And that actually crystallizes into like a new rock down in between the pores in the pore space of the sandstone.
So what kind of rock would that be identified as?
It would be it would be like a carbonate. The as rocks get older and get compressed and different fluids move through them, the process where those little spaces in between the grains are filled in is called diagenesis.
Okay.
And so it's like, it mimics this natural diagenetic effect.
Okay. Is that similar to the shale?
It does reduce the ability of fluid to flow through, but it's not going to eliminate it as the shale does.
Okay. So shale would be less permeable than this new rock.
Much less.
Okay.
Order of magnitude.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Louisiana has one permit, Class 6 permit,
That's right.
so far that's been issued. There has been a moratorium on new requests for permit, but there are several permits underway right now that will be going through the process. Do you see any issue with the ones that are in the processing phase right now?
There's, I've gotten asked that before, what's the quality of these permits like?
Mm-hmm.
And, it's relatively a mixed bag, but overall these permits are extremely good submissions. I mean, the expense that goes into developing one of these projects and one of these permits, you don't just submit anything, that would be a terrible waste of money. Because these are so expensive to put together.
Yeah.
The projects that are in line right now, are in the permit queue, have different economic reasons for why they exist or want to exist. And some of that relies on some of these federal tax credits that are somewhat up in the air. But there's other reasons too. Some of these LNG facilities have to meet a low carbon fuel standard to ship to certain countries. Some of these biofuels companies are creating like a negative carbon negative energy and getting these voluntary market agreements or benefits, cash benefits to make them profitable. Other folks are working on developing like biodiesels for companies to meet, like jet fuel companies to meet their low carbon fuel standards. Yeah. So there is sort of a mixed bag of why folks are proposing these different projects. So as far as saying if one's bad or not, I think they're all in pretty good shape. But it doesn't matter really what kind of shape they come in. Even if they're terrible, they're going to go through this extremely rigorous review phase. That first permit that was issued was under review by the EPA for, I believe, 2 years before the state got control of the program. And then it was still under control by the state for another 1.5 years. Oh. These reviews are extremely rigorous, and the application goes through multiple phases of evaluation. The applicant has to revise and update the application as necessary. And then, of course, at the end, there's public notice and public hearing. Yeah. So the public is aware of the project.
Okay. So I guess the bottom line factor is there cause for concern for these wells?
My goal today is to educate your listeners about making the best decision for them.
Right.
And having any injection well is going to be more risk than having none at all.
Okay.
And so I think the goal for your constituents here with the association is to decide if additional risk is worth the benefit that comes with having these wells or, CO2 projects in their vicinity. Mm-hmm. So, the risk for the actual injection well itself is severely, I will say the project is severely de-risked by the regulatory process because of all the things that have to be in place in order to get the permit. But that's not to say that there's no risk. But I guess I can throw a few other sort of evaluative processes that these permits have to go through. One thing is that all projects have to have insurance. Mm-hmm. So they have to convince a bank that their project or insurer that their project is, not going to break their bank. They also have to have financial surety. They have to get bonds. So they do have to convince an actual accredited banking institution to issue them bonds, typically for millions of dollars for coverage of these sites. So it's not just the regulators that are making a decision about whether these permits are safe. There's a lot of other folks that have to get convinced. And the last people, is the public, the people that actually control in Louisiana. the folks who control the pore space, which is the surface owner, and the CO2 storage rights lie with the surface owner. So, anybody who is wanting to store CO2 has to negotiate rights to store that in the pore space with the surface owner. So there's a lot of different, approvals that folks have to get besides just the permit.
That process is, as far as getting, negotiating with the surface rights folks is not really different than negotiating with the mineral rights.
No, it's very similar.
Okay. You just have to agree on what someone is willing to risk versus how much they're willing to get paid.
That's right.
Okay.
And now in Louisiana, there's a unitization process that's very similar to oil and gas unitization as well. So in many respects, it mimics that process.
Okay, explain what unitization means.
So unitization is, the CO2 plume in the subsurface has been modeled. The model shows where the highest likelihood of the CO2 is to reside in the subsurface. Depending on the type of formation that you're in, how thick it is, that the sandstone that we've been talking about will determine oftentimes the geographic reach of that plume. And so, a lot of times that will come under multiple people's property. And so the unitization process is a way to essentially draw a boundary around where that CO2 will exist and say, the state says to the applicant that they have to own the majority of, or own agreements for the majority of that pore space. In Louisiana, now that's 85%. It's gone up from 75%. And so the applicant has to convince 85% of the geographic area to commit to an agreement to store the CO2 in the subsurface. Okay.
And that alone may not be an easy task as well.
I understand it could be quite challenging, actually.
It's all a process. What is the most difficult part of that process? We've talked a lot about, you got to get the agreement with the surface owners who own the pore space. You've got to make sure that the carbon's going to be in a certain area. It's going to be capped by the shale. And what is the most difficult part of this whole process?
That's a good question. If you can get your landowner agreements, the next step is to show the state that this is the unit should be where it should be. So you're hopefully the plume is consistent with the application. And once it goes in front of the board that decides about the unit location and approval, you have to present the science in front of the board to show that that's where it needs to be. So maybe that is the most, I think probably getting the land rights is the most. Again, I don't have a lot of experience with that part of it, but, once you get the land rights, as long as you can show that the project is worthwhile, and presumably at this point, an applicant has made progress on their application, so that they've been able to show an insurer, the state, a bank, that the project is valid, it should go smoothly from there.
It's a question I probably should have asked a long time ago. How do you know what's down there?
That is a wonderful question.
Sorry for asking so late, but
this is this is one of, just as a kind of a geology nerd. One of the things that I love the best about my job is figuring out what's down there, and there's a lot of tools that exist for us to do that. In the CO2 wells, you're required to take what's called a core.
Okay.
So a core is, and you probably imagine like what your head thinks of when you think of a core. It's a cylindrical piece of rock that's actually drilled out of the formation that you're going to inject in, and that it's confining. So the core is required to be pulled so that the state can confirm that there is actually a good injection formation, and most importantly, that there's a good confining formation, that shale, that the permeability of that shale is extremely low. It can never be defined as zero. A zero permeability substance is probably like a lab produced plastic, that is just super compressed. But an extreme low permeability is something that like one drop of water would take 2 million years to pass through a space of 1 milliliter, for example.
Okay. So it can still pass through, but it's going to take a long time.
Exactly. Yeah. And I probably should have defined that sooner, what that extreme low permeability is on these shales. But the core tells you that you have a good zone and you have a good confining zone, but then you perform these lab analyses on the core to determine, and that goes into your model to figure out how far out the CO2 will go.
Okay.
So that's an important part of the process. And then the second way to characterize what's down there is by running what are called electric logs. And this is technology that's existed since like the late 20s, probably like the 40s reliably. And there are known patterns that different types of rocks and formations have. And by running what's called a wireline log, an electric log through these formations, the data pattern that you get back tells you exactly what type of rock you have, and it tells you what type of formation fluid is in there. So there's a lot of information you can obtain without ever having to see the rock.
Wow.
Yeah, there's great tools out there.
That's interesting. Should have asked that a long time ago, but
okay.
It just, again, it's a pretty involved subject. It's new. I think for some people it does make them a bit nervous.
Sure, I understand that. I can speak to the longevity of the design of these projects. An oil and gas well is kind of like the construction of that well is probably like the car that I drove up here in, SUV, and the construction of a class 6 injection well is like a tank in comparison. There's more metal that's required to actually be in the ground. There's more specialized type of metal. There's more corrosion monitoring required on these wells. There's specialized cement that's required to lodge these metal pieces into place. There's a lot more that is required on these wells than oil and gas wells. And those oil and gas wells have had a lot of longevity with their I'll call it classic design, not a bad design. It's served its purpose very well.
Yeah.
But, you know, if there's anything I can add or how I can compare it to oil and gas wells, that's what I would say, is that these wells are truly designed to be there forever. And there should never, ever be a problem with them. And they're going to be monitored for a long time to make sure that that's the case.
Okay. Is there anything I have not asked you yet that we should let our listeners know?
Well, I guess I'll just add to the groundwater aspect because I think that's the thing that I get the most questions about.
Okay.
Is my drinking water really going to be safe if I have one of these projects nearby? And I just want to emphasize that the whole point of a Class 6 permit is to prove that the drinking water will remain safe. It's not to say, oh, you can do this in the subsurface. I mean, it grants that right, but the evaluation is designed to ensure that the drinking water will never be impacted. And, the way that this technology has developed is based on decades of injection experience. The rules were created by the EPA, and Louisiana's rules are even stronger than those. So, and I understand people's concern. Truly, I mean, I do. And I think that would be what I would try to add to the debate or to the discussion, I guess, is just to keep in mind why the regulatory program even exists. And it's for that reason.
Okay. Corey Shircliff, geologist with Cavern Solutions in Baton Rouge. We thank you so much. We enjoyed having you at the annual convention this year. I really appreciate you taking time for us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate you having me.
Thank you for listening to Mind of the Forest. This episode was sponsored by First South Farm Credit. First South is your premier rural lender. With over 100 years financing timber and agriculture, they have the expertise you're looking for when financing rural property. If you're looking to purchase or refinance land, call your local First South Farm Credit office or find them online at firstsouthland.com. If you'd like to learn more about sustainable forestry, the SFI, the LFA and its programs, and how you can be part of an organization that supports landowners, loggers, and the forest products industry in Louisiana, check out our website at laforestry.com. This is our last episode of 2025, and in looking to 2026, we're always looking for topics that could be of interest to you, our audience. If you have a topic suggestion, send me an email at jzeringue at laforestry.com. That's JZERINGUE at laforestry.com. If you have any questions about being a Mind of the Forest sponsor, you can send me a message to the same email address. We have 14 shows each year, and we invite you to inquire about the possibility of you being a Mind of the Forest sponsor. Don't forget to check out our show notes where you can find out the contact information for us and the contact information for our guest for this episode. Also, you can subscribe to Mind of the Forest by clicking on the subscribe button on your favorite podcast app, and be sure to tap on the notification button as well, so that way you'll know when we drop a new episode every month. Thank you for doing that. We really do appreciate it. Always remember, at the Louisiana Forestry Association, we're Mind of the Forest for you.